Cloud. Okay, Sam, I'm so sorry. Can you, this is, let's see, which one is this? This is Reimagining Wealth Initiative number 30, and Vinicius is in Egypt, and I don't know, Tiberius might come in 10 minutes. I don't know. But so Sam just like uh, kind of came up with his thesis, which, if I can rephrase it in a minute, it's like, these engineers have been able to do this like open source software in a large scale, and we're kind of this is my take on it. We're trying to kind of figure out and see what is preventing people who are not in software from achieving that kind of thing, just like engineers have. And I I have been trying to figure this out for a long time, like what is, why aren't we using GitHub? Why isn't GitHub working for like normal people, and what is preventing non-engineers from achieving this? So it's also non-obvious to me, and and I think that my input is that you know as an engineer, you have these libraries of things that are available to you. You have these components that you can use to quickly build up new things. And we do not have that infrastructure yet. These kind of collective intelligence components that can be reused and repurposed to like Legos to build up complex structures. So I mean, my theory is that we're kind of lacking um, those component structures, and some and those are not necessarily like sexy things to build. Like there's some things that we're lacking that are not, yeah, that like the unsexiness, like the boring, almost like kind of bureaucratic boring stuff. No one actually wants to build it. No one's incentivized to do that. So I think that, in my opinion, is kind of what we're lacking. And it's people kind of like Tiberius and me who are doing that like kind of like grunt work, but it's not appreciated, and it's not um recognized, and it's real like crap work, I think.
Yeah, well, and that's a useful perspective. I would just clarify that so there is a lot of commonality with open source and like GitHub as a theme. I should clarify that I say that as a metaphor because so here's the kind of the fundamental thing, and this is all right. So um, whether we're talking about software, whether we're talking about an art project, whether we're talking about creating a local machine together,
Mhm.
um, whether we're talking about like kind of trying to organize with a couple people in our community to kind of affect some policy change. So I've heard this and from some peers who've been helpful kind of talk about this is speculative realism. The idea is that we're here. I don't know which way this is going to record on the screen. So we're here, and somebody has a vision. Somebody has an idea of like it would be nice to get here.
Mhm.
And what happens in a lot of these situations, including open source software, is they say, we're here, we'd like to get here. It would be really nice to be here. These would be the benefits. This is really important, etc. And they kind of communicate that, and they share that with others, with the idea being that maybe it's possible for one person to get from here to here and make that kind of cross that gap. But it's probably going to be a lot more easier and a lot more capable if other people are involved.
Mhm.
You also learn like if it's actually useful, if you talk about it with other people and you can get some validation through the feedback, because it's one thing to say, I have a great idea, this could be really valuable, it could be really nice to get from here to here. And then it's another thing for people to say, I agree. And the more people who say, I agree, that's more validation, that's more testament that that's a useful thing to do. So I would just go back to kind of Unai's comment. I would say that I'm not really like trying to do anything except share a pattern which can be useful for people who are trying to do stuff and people who feel blocked. And especially, and this goes back to the earlier conversation, because I've experienced this myself and I've seen countless examples of it. So many people getting blocked by this like monolithic like funding. It's like, I need funding. And like at funding point, then things happen. Everything before is just going to funding. The reality is if you get funding, that's going to, when you're going from here to here, the funding is just going to that middle stuff. And you can get that middle stuff without having funding. So in the case of, in the case of, I don't know, let's say like a new piece of hardware. So in the case of a new piece of hardware, you're right here today, you're saying this piece of hardware would be awesome. That hardware is going to require some software components, some kind of like 3D design, like OpenCAD type stuff, probably some like, I don't know, graphic design, branding type things. So one approach could be spend a lot of time, a lot of months trying to get funding. So you can go hire those engineers and then hire the people to help on OpenCAD and hire the person to help with the graphics. Another approach is to say, hey, I'm trying to build this hardware thing that I really believe in. I think it would be really cool. And I'm looking for help. Like this is where we want to get to. I think this is a really good idea. These are some of the specific things that we need to get done and areas of capacity that are needed to realize this thing. And if you're interested, like, let's just talk about doing it and making it happen. And that gives us agency because it enables us to actually look specifically at, what are the steps in front of us to make progress, and start doing those. And Unai dropped a link in the chat to Sensorica here. Yeah, and I just wanted to say that I think this is very much, when I've had conversations with TB and looking at the stuff, it's very resonant in the sense that like, if you're going to start a venture on Sensorica, the idea is like you can post your page, you can create your Sensorica venture page, but then it's not like people are just going to come to it and funding is going to appear. Then you need to go and talk with people about it. You need to get people in the Sensorica community on board with what you're trying to do. And so, yeah, I think basically just kind of trying to introduce that as a pattern, a way for people to take agency on the initiatives that they're trying to work on and how they can make progress by just, even if you don't know exactly what you need to get from here to get to here, you can at least share it with other people, talk about it as an alternative to kind of writing emails in a silo, which you might never even get responses to. Like I rarely ever heard of grant funding applications giving like real dedicated specific feedback or much other kind of help from that. So it's just an opportunity cost. Like, you can choose to really chase this funding thing and just be cognizant of all of the time, energy, and effort that goes into that. And likewise, one of many different potential alternatives is you can say the thing that you're trying to do, say the thing that you're trying to realize find a way to communicate it. It might be hard to communicate, but if you're writing funding applications or if you expect to talk to anybody, you're going to have to find some way to communicate it. It doesn't need to be words. It doesn't need to be a short pitch. It doesn't need to be video. It's just really, whatever helps you communicate the idea. And then share it with people, start conversations. If you need help, ask for help. If you need recommendations for other people who might have ideas for help, ask for that too. And then just actually start living the process of creating this thing and making it happen.
So I understand where you're coming from, and I've been living this and trying to do that for years and years. And I now know what are the issues with that idea. And so, like in open source software, it is possible to build complex things now, as long as you don't like you're not like trying to kind of take ownership of it, or um the but what I'm trying to say is like um there are complex issues with reputation and ownership, and if you don't care at all, like you're just trying to um you know do something, and you like have a vision of some kind of wonderful thing you just want out in the world, that's one thing. But if it's like your life's work and you want to, you've invested like 20 years into doing that, it becomes complicated when other people are working on it. Then who owns that, who controls that? And those issues are very, very tricky. And when you then there's no money and people are trying to work on things and help each other, and then they have a disagreement, who owns that? And there are no it's harder when it's not software to just fork something and blah blah blah. It just becomes the amount of complexity in that is difficult. And so what I'm seeing is that there people who have been trying to collaborate for years and years, they all see this problem from a different point of view, and they are each working on a bit of this problem. And now we have groups developing real solutions to this problem of decentralized collaboration. Um, but now they're siloed. So I see it as um, we have um, we have different solutions produced by different groups, these innovations, but they're mainly siloed now. And getting other groups to understand what these other groups have actually accomplished and stitching it together into something that is like a working kind of machine is a difficult endeavor, because everyone is using kind of different words to describe things. And the discovery factor of, in a decentralized system, trying to um, figure out how to deliver some information to someone who's not actually asking for it. Like someone might have a problem and they don't know what their problem is, or how to define it, or how to talk about it, or even that they have a problem. And figuring out how to get this information to come together in smarter ways. It's just like I think there's a lot of um complexities there. So that's what why I came up with my idea of wedding tables, where um my idea is that if you have an idea, you might need um there's probably like a system that you need in order to first, like, my conception it would be to, you might go to like the story table, where these people help you, they listen to you, and then they help you um explain your story better. And they help you get the graphics and the PowerPoint, and they might take your presentation, which is an hour, and give you feedback in terms of, these are the 5 minutes that are understandable, that are compelling, and here you go. You now have a 5-minute presentation instead of an hour presentation. But we need like help like this, kind of like organized help of like a pipeline. And that's what I've been trying to build, this pipeline where you just have an idea and you're kind of taken through this intelligent pipeline of being able to describe your idea, being able to break it down and test it. And if it is like, if it tests well and it's like your idea is valid, then you go to the next step. What is the next step? You know, so yeah, I'm just saying I'm there with you and
And
trying
what
to
about
build out what you're talking about.
ideas that don't progress in terms of a pipeline?
um, like what kind of ideas?
Well, that's kind of implying an architecture for the way that, you know, ideas, or the way that, let's just say, because it's getting abstract, but that's what it is. You know, this is implying an architecture, a single architecture,
Uh-huh.
for the way that something comes from like an idea or a potentiality to real life.
Mhm.
Um, so, I mean, I won't ask like a question. It sounds a little bit like lacking freedom, in the sense of like, here's an idea for a system, like this system will work, this is how it always should go.
Mhm.
Um, this is like the system that's needed. A little bit technocratic in that way.
Mhm.
As a different example, there's a piece which was very influential for me, hey Anthony, called it's like collaboratively authoring decisions or outcomes together.
Mhm.
And this is just a different model.
Mhm.
And so this is a research paper which I think is very well done. And it's talking in the context of an organization. It they're not trying to say this is the right thing to do or
Mhm.
what you should do. They're saying that this is the way that decisions are made in the context of an organization, and you can either be like aware of it or not.
Mhm.
So it's useful. And the way that actually goes is it's kind of like a cone. And so I thought this might be helpful in terms of comparing a pipeline to a cone. So a pipeline might be like this. The cone, it's like this, right?
Mhm.
And so at the top, like the circumference of your cone is
Mhm.
the amount of possibilities that this thing
Mhm.
could be. So say like, you know, one person has an idea in their head, that might be a very small circumference cone. As more people can bring their perspectives, that cone gets wider and wider. There's more stuff you can explore. That's not always a good thing, but it's just a reality. More possibilities, more opportunities come from more perspectives, the wider the cone. So as you start making decisions or talking about this topic, which is
Mhm.
like, you know, what are some key like elements or features? You know, what are the most important things here? Then you start going down the cone from this wide top circumference to the ending point, which is just, they call it a decision spike. So
Mhm.
as you make decisions about whatever this topic or whatever this thing we're going to do is going to be, the cone gets more narrow as you go down. But I would just say that it makes a very interesting and specific point that you can also go back up the cone. So it's not one way in the sense of a pipeline. I didn't know if that was implied. I just think
Mhm.
about that when that comes to mind. And I've used this in my life where
Mhm.
there have been things that I've been working on. And I've used this metaphor of a cone. There's better language, which you can get into the specifics. But I realized like I'm a step too far down at the cone right now, and that's constraining my possibilities towards this single decision point. And
Mhm.
I don't think this is on the right path. So I'm going to actually go back up the cone.
Mhm.
So there's more possibilities available and more things that you can explore and like different decision points you can end up at. And this was a long explanation, but just to say one, like I'm not, I think that would be an impossible task to like design a single system through
Mhm.
which ideas come to fruition.
Yeah, I don't so that's not really my view of system design, but what there could be are different patterns on how you could achieve success, but we don't even have like one working pattern now, let alone like the
I disagree though. And the whole point of what I'm saying is I'm trying
Uh-huh.
to share a pattern which is validated and it
Uh-huh.
happens over and over again in reality. It's just whether or not we want to learn from it.
Okay.
So on Friday, I shared that post from Jay Krebs, that Twitter
Mm.
thread, the founder of Apache Kafka, who, in just in a couple of tweets, he outlines, we started this thing at LinkedIn. I didn't know if it was going to be useful. We're thinking about starting a company out of it. I had no idea if it was going to be useful or not. We could have started the company, but I decided to share this thing as just a blog post first to see if people were interested, to see if it would be validated. They started this thing. I'm pretty sure it's an open source company. Now it went to an IPO. Another real world example, Andy Weir, the author of the book, The Martian, which was later turned into the film, The Martian. The way that book started was Andy Weir writing small posts, you'd say maybe even portions or parts of chapters on Reddit, with the community of people on Reddit. And over time, he was writing this stuff, people liked it, people supported it, people validated, he kept writing, and he wrote enough on Reddit that eventually at some point it kind of turned into a book. The examples are there in software all the time. The examples in terms of real world, like let's say hardware projects, where it's, I mean, it's commonplace, it's pervasive nowadays. Like just look at precious plastic. Like people share designs, people share visions for hardware they're working on. They do it together. And same thing for kind of organizing in politics. It's like somebody wants to get shit done in a place, like mutual aid during the pandemic. That's the epitome of it. It's like people are trying to survive. People need food. People need toiletries. The community works together, organizes to get that stuff done together. So with all of that said, I think earlier you brought up a really important and interesting point when it comes to like new initiatives, which is around the ownership of them. Open source indeed makes that much easier because you don't have the implied ownership conversations. So it's more permissionless. People don't feel that same barrier. There's that same friction at the start of the thing. So I have some more thoughts on that, but I just wanted to say that what I tried to share with you and what I'm trying to communicate is that there is a pattern. And that pattern is finding a way to communicate what we're trying to do with people and trying to do it together. And it happens time and time again across industries and across like literally media formats. So, well, that's good that that's on video for the record now, because that's been all in my mind, but it's true. It's like, it is a pattern, as you said. And I just want to make it clear that like that is a pattern that is validated and happens over and over again.
Do you have the name of the document you were talking about? This one that describes the cone?
Yeah.
Yes, I do. I have a link to it.
Okay, I think it's even better. Can you put it in the chat maybe?
Yes, I will.
Oh,
And I also have, so the context of this, I won't get too into it, but I'll drop a link to kind of something I shared with Lauren. I haven't really shared it with anybody else yet. It's very early stage. It's not done yet. Like you guys are glad to see it. I'm just saying why I didn't like share it with anybody else. It's not that I'm being like private or like seclusive or something. It's just early stage. But anyway, there's a little blog post I have which gives some context for kind of some short takeaways that I got from the paper. And I'll share that. So I just put the link to the research paper. Let me just make sure that link works. It took me like 1 or 2 times reading it. It's not so long, it's like 30 pages, but it's a little bit, well, it might take some patience to get through. And if this has like a paywall or something, then I'll link to a version that is not paywalled. It is paywalled. I'll fetch a link that's not paywalled. One of the main takeaways for me from it was that.
all I need is a title.
Sorry?
I'll find it through Sci-Hub. I just need the title or the document identifier.
Yep, I will post the title. Do you get access to everything through Sci-Hub?
Yeah, pretty much.
Oh, that's great.
It's good to, you should explore it if you haven't. It's good stuff. And support it if you can. They always need support. It's like one person in Russia doing the whole thing.
Wow, okay, that's really good to know. I just added a link to a little post that I wrote talking about this pattern in some ways, even getting in a little bit to the ownership questions, which again, in the case of like not open source projects. So one other thing here, which I'd say is interesting, and then I'll kind of cede the floor. There's a paper from like 100 years ago, which is trying to understand, or maybe it was talking about 100 years ago, basically like according to capitalism and according to markets, corporations and organizations shouldn't exist. according to like markets and capitalism, it should just be like this freelancer-based system where like people are trying to do stuff. They create service contractors with people who can accomplish stuff for them. Very kind of fluid in that way.
Mhm.
And so there's this paper I came across, I can't think of the name of it now, but I tried to find it, which is trying to understand how corporations happened under capitalism. And what they came back to is just, it was actually a result of the transaction costs. So like the transaction costs of like entering like an engaged like service contract between two people, the transaction costs from moving one to another, the kind of transaction costs around IP and that type of thing. That is what led from what they argued would be the more natural form of kind of a free market capitalistic economic system to like the corporation just being like, we don't want to deal with those transaction costs. The freelancers being like, we don't want to deal with the stress in those transaction costs. So the corporation absorbs the freelancers and the freelancers kind of consent to that as well. But it just comes back to what you were saying as well, Lauren. It's like, you know, the transaction costs in some of these cases can be figuring out like, you know, what is the ownership structure? Who owns what? You know, where does the money go to? Who is doing the work? I think that there are paths forward on that, but I won't keep talking anymore right now.
Sounds like an interesting subject, that's for sure. You gotta have a look at this paper though. It's hard to talk about a paper. They're pretty complicated usually.
It has some cool examples in it, but it's pretty visual. It's just like you really kind of got to get a grip on the language. So the stuff it's talking about, it's like potentialities.
Okay.
My main takeaway from it is that the more perspectives that we have exploring a given topic, the more possibilities we're able to see.
Yeah.
So the more things are possible. That's like the very simple, but it's about, yeah, like, I don't know, collaborative authoring of outcomes. That just means like thinking about what a diversity of people want and like how that diversity of people makes real outcomes happen together. So that's the idea of like authoring outcomes.
Sounds like very general concept, but they're giving a pretty specific name, authoring of outcomes. You would talk about acting and thinking together as a group maybe, or consensus decision making, or there's lots of different ways to phrase this. It would be basically equivalent.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, you get into it, like you see the language is a little bit, I mean, I understand why they picked the language they did. You're right, there's probably a number of ways they could say it, but it's not consensus decision making, it's not stuff like that. And it's also, what I was mentioning to Lauren, it's not recommending, like, it's not recommending a pattern like consensus decision making or like top-down decision making or flat or whatever. Rather, it's kind of like observing, and it's kind of trying to say, based on what we know, this is how decisions are made in a group context. And it's like you can either like be aware of it or not, but this is
Sounds like good stuff. Yeah, because
how they-
Occupy and thereafter, that was a big part of what we were doing. Was trying to figure out how to make decisions as a group and stuff. So I'll check out this document for sure.
It just seems to me like we have how I see the world is we have so much stuff developed that people have worked on, these wonderful kind of inventions and things that people have done around decision making and reputation and this, and putting it together so you have just what you need when you need it. That is another level of innovation that we don't have. So the friction is very, very high because you essentially have to learn all of this yourself. And then, oh, we're in a group and we're needing to make a decision. How do we make a decision together? Okay, there's like holacracy, but then you have to, you know, learn holacracy, like so getting it so that it's in like a chatbot style of, oh, it looks like you're making this decision. Let me guide you through that. That's not there, and that's so.
Clippy was the Microsoft assistant. Always did stuff like that.
Clippy.
Anyway,
What?
sorry. Go ahead. Sorry to cut you off, Lauren.
So I'm just saying, I think we, with certain, I can see that we're at like a, I don't know, precipice or something like, there's the possibility of massive innovation, but to get us there, it's like we're lacking a certain kind of intelligence.
Can I say though that I've often found. Sorry, did I cut you off again? You're like, I thought I had a. Anyway, this peer-to-peer methods of getting stuff done through decentralized approaches, it always has at least a few rules that the individual peers have to have in their head.
Mhm.
If you try to export the rule set to like Clippy or a piece of software or something, then whoever controls the piece of software now has a disordinate control over the rest of the system that you probably don't want them to have, because if things ever really do get interesting,
Mhm.
there's a lot of money at stake or something, you're going to start abusing that control. It might work for trivial projects, but it's not going to work for anything serious.
Yeah, for sure.
Wait. Can you say what? Sorry, can you repeat that, Anthony? So what I'm specifically trying to understand is what would not work under what circumstances?
When you have a group of people and you're trying to do things in a decentralized way, it seems like one of the only modes of operations that really works is that everybody has to have a copy of the rules in their head, and then they all collaborate based on this protocol, basically. It's a protocol, but it can be quite sizable. It can require software to encode a lot of the algorithms and stuff that make it work, like with Bitcoin. And if you try to have like a Clippy, like a piece of advisory software that tells people what to do and when, then somebody can modify the Clippy, or somebody has to have control of the software sooner or later, right?
Mhm.
So it just puts a backdoor in the whole organization and how they make decisions. If people don't have the complete copy of the protocol that they can look over and make sure check it over and make sure there's no backdoors, then you get abuse sooner or later. So it's just trending towards centralization. If people don't have a complete copy of the protocol,
Mhm.
I'm saying like if you were trying to observe like this group of academics did in this paper, you try to look out at the world and see how people actually make decisions.
Mhm.
One of the few ways that peer-to-peer decentralized decisions actually do get made and these organizations actually do work, when they do work, is that you have a bunch of people and they all have a copy of the protocol. And it can be quite a long, complicated protocol, unfortunately, which takes time to learn because you have to import it into the head of the human, right?
Yeah.
Like learning how to use Bitcoin it's pretty complicated, actually, surprisingly complicated, and it's kind of hard to learn because there's not really any good documents to really let you import the information quickly, as far as I can tell. But yeah, so this is one of my observations. Does that make sense, Tim? You have a group of people.
It does indeed make sense.
Yeah, because I think it's a really critical point. It's come up quite a number of times over the years and has been driven home to me as an important piece of the foundation in getting stuff done in a decentralized manner, is that you have a bunch of peers and they all have a copy of a protocol. And it sounds very simple, but it's the only thing that seems to work. If you do it
No, we call that pattern language.
language is one term I've heard.
Yeah.
So just a quick thing that I want to share, building on that, Anthony, is like one. I mean, I don't think we should talk about decentralization or holacracy out of like a dogmatic perspective. I would be willing to go there on a concept like subsidiarity in many cases, where subsidiarity is saying like you're allocating decision making to like the most localized node. Maybe I would get dogmatic about that. I'm more of just what I'm trying to say is that like, decentralization, holacracy, these are all different choices that we can make. And in some contexts, some might be more useful than others. Wanted to share an example of one interesting thing that I've come across recently. It's actually from one of like the lawyers who's been most prolific in terms of like open source licenses and things like that. It's something like a collaborator's covenant. where that's just an interesting protocol where it's not open source, but it's kind of saying, and there's a technical component to it, which is saying like anybody who contributes to this thing then has like full kind of ownership or kind of like license over it. So just saying one of the other many possibilities that are out there. I'll try to find a link to that, Lauren, if it's useful. And the third thing, which was probably the most important thing that I wanted to say, maybe it's gone. But so in terms of kind of being on the same page about a protocol and having that shared and agreed upon, it's just reminding me a little bit of this paper, you know, The Tyranny of Structurelessness.
Yeah, I am well aware of that.
Right, and I actually haven't even read it. I've heard it recommended a lot of times, so like shame on me. But the way that I heard it kind of phrased succinctly recently is the idea is that if there's not an explicit structure, there's an implicit structure, and that will come out one way or another. So none of what I'm trying to say is like, you know, the pattern is like this, and this is how it should be, and it should be holacracy, or it should be decentralized, or it should be decentralized voting. I'm not kind of indicating any of that, and I don't think there's a one size fits all, but it does certainly make sense that when there's a group of people who are coming together to start something, to have those types of conversations. And the one thing to remember, of course, is like, if it is open source, then the transaction costs basically go to zero, because like the protocol is there, you know, and it's open.
So I do think that my idea is there's not like a single like pipeline, like this is the way that you need to do a project and there's no other way. But to each endeavor, to each like collaborative endeavor, there are certain things which always exist. For example, you need to make decisions about things. You need to figure out, you know, who owns what. You do need some, especially if it goes far enough, you need some methodology to crap detection, and so on and so forth. There are certain things which, you know, are always kind of there. Yeah.
I'm not sure if I understood you perfectly. You need certain mechanisms and parts of that go into your protocol, maybe. Is there certain features that have to be part of your organization to have a smart organization?
Yeah, so I mean, my work is like, so my work lies in kind of incubation, from like early stage incubation from, so what I do is form high resonant groups that can ideate well. They come out with memes or ideas that then I'm trying to figure out how to successfully incubate those into projects, and how to give people the tools that they need, so it's not too complex. Because if the tools are too complex, like holacracy, that's like a whole you don't want them to have to like learn a new, you know, governance style. It's just like, how can you give people just the tools that they need at that stage to make it be like, so it's like permissionless innovation of they can go forward, they have what they need to go forward, but not too much so that they're overwhelmed.
I gotcha.
Yeah, so that's kind of what that's my work.
Well, sorry, I got a phone call. Hello?
I'm just trying to find that collaborators covenant. So, I mean, Lauren, I'm just going to share this kind of openly, and I'm going to communicate openly, is that I'm getting, so I would say actually the wedding table thing, I have a little bit of a different perspective on it in terms of bringing concepts to kind of a community which is there, which can support. That really resonates. I would just maybe not make it so specialized, because I think like seeing people in a specialization category, sometimes it can be useful, sometimes it can also be limiting. I just get, I don't know, I just feel like this kind of imposition, it just feels a little bit top down to me, what you're describing. And like even the idea, you know, of like bringing a group of people together who like might not know how to like figure out how to work on stuff themselves, and like I'm going to assist them with like getting these memes together, and once they have this conversation, like I'm going to help turn those memes into projects we can incubate.
Mhm.
It just feels top down to me, and I don't want to say that in maybe like an accusatory way.
Mhm.
I'm talking almost from like a pragmatic perspective where I don't fully see like the usefulness
Mhm.
of that. Um,
Actually, I'm not trying to do a top down. I'm trying to do it using emergent design. So what I'm trying to do is like figure out what components you need to have for a system to work, even if they're very, very, very simple, to have it be so you don't need the top down authority. And there's some complexity in what do you actually need to have a system that can go on itself without like complete failure because you forgot an essential component. So that is the essence of my work, is what you actually need to have a decentralized system that can go on its own and get smarter over time.
That sounds like a really cool project. It's very similar to what I've thought many times over the years. What at the time I called it people group programming,
Okay.
and it sounds it's kind of some parallels between synthetic biology, right? They've got some people that are trying to figure out the most basic bacteria that you could make that actually is viable. Like, you know what I'm saying? Have you heard of
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
It is a really great project. It's extremely worthwhile and extremely general purpose. If you can make any progress at all on it, then major benefits should shake out of that in terms of improving the efficacy of a very wide range of different projects that people are always trying to undertake in the peer-to-peer world, or just generally. Because I'm of the opinion that you pretty much have centralized organizations and you have decentralized organizations, and the centralized ones have major problems because they tend to deteriorate into dictatorships,
Hmm.
whether that's in the form of a corporation or when it's a small country, or if it's a political group or whatever.
Hmm.
So decentralized approaches really are more important than they first appear. Like, they're not just a little thing that fanboys like, they do have fundamental value.
but what we're even but like saying centralized and decentralized isn't that helpful, because for one, it's at the very least a spectrum.
Yeah,
It's
but
not
I mean,
binary.
yeah,
But two, like I don't even know if a spectrum is the right representation. And so something that comes to mind, for example, is like Wikipedia. Wikipedia is very much not decentralized. Wikipedia is by no means decentralized. It features some principles of decentralization, but it's very far from a decentralized system. And yet it's worked really, really well. And then I don't know, like name me a true decentralized system that works really well. If you name any major blockchain, you see where the concentration of that is at, or you see where the power of that is actually concentrated. It's entirely centralized. Bitcoin, Ethereum, you see who owns the tokens, who owns the mining hardware.
yeah.
The decentralized systems are entirely centralized. So basically what I'm trying to say is, you know, what are we talking about? And like, if we're
Yeah,
gonna say like,
I agree. When there's, I have read some stuff on this, and the idea is, how would you determine, like, try to measure how decentralized or not decentralized an organization was, like a group of people? You could measure, you'd make a histogram of the people involved. Suppose you have like 100 people, and each one would have their own little bar, and it has a height and the amount of relative power they have, in terms of basically measure in terms of what they can get away with doing despite the objections of other people. It might be stealing money, it might be just being an asshole, whatever it is. And then the more they can get away with, the larger their histogram is. So the ones that have really bumpy histograms, like a corporation is going to have the CEO, which has tons of power. They can do whatever they want. And then all the little employees at the bottom have very little power. So the bumpier the histogram is, the more centralized the organization tends to be. And there's, you might call it a spectrum. Now you have a histogram and you're trying to pack it into one number.
Hmm.
If you're putting something on a spectrum, so you have to have some kind of algorithm to weight the different rectangles, but the different bars. So it's not easy to put it on a spectrum, but that's one way of describing it, like visually, right? Like there's certainly a spread of different. And I agree with you that a lot of the supposedly decentralized organizations, like Bitcoin,
Mhm.
and many of the other cryptocurrencies and peer-to-peer undertakings,
Mhm.
they're much more centralized than they should be. And this is something I've read a number of times from another of reliable authors.
Mhm.
It's just an ongoing problem because we're still working on how to do things in a decentralized way, basically. We need Lauren's help, that's all. We just-
So a question from there, or maybe just one more point, is that so it seems like part of this conversation when we're talking about the protocols and the components, it feels very technological. To kind of illustrate what I'm trying to say is you could give another community a set of rules like Wikipedia,
Mm.
and I'm not sure if just from the rules themselves, the same spectrum would emerge, because what I'm getting at is there's probably an element of culture and social factors, which
They could say that's part of the
probably
rule set, though. You could say that was part of the rule set, but you could also say
wait. You can't make culture a rule set. Like you can talk about values, but like you can't, like people's behavior, the people's
Go into the rule
perspectives,
set.
the way people interact with each other can't come from a rule set.
Sure, why not? They're computers. People are just computers,
Yeah, I think it can.
basically.
Okay, and so, I mean, do you mean like brains are like computers, or what?
Yeah, brains are computers. I think
Okay,
that's fair.
so there's a lot of research talking about how that's a meme, which has many centuries of origins, and actually, as
Yeah,
the
they used to
development
think
of
it
the
was a
computer,
telephone system, right? And then it was
well,
whatever the latest thing is. Yeah.
and like the abacus before that.
Yeah. Well, but an abacus is
Yeah,
kind of a
I mean, I
computer.
would
That's the
just
thing.
challenge or right. I mean, I don't agree with you. Maybe that's the crux of the argument, is like, I don't agree
Oh.
that people are computers or so mechanistic. And I also think that, I mean, so there's the aspect of like people, it's like determinism, right? So like people as well as time itself, like, is there free will or not? I've gone through phases on this. I definitely do not think there's a clear answer, but in any case, that might be the crux of the disagreement, is that I don't think by a rule set you can get an outcome like Wikipedia. That takes a lot of different approaches to conflict resolution, takes a lot of different approaches to kind of consensus decision making. Consensus decision making, not in like a, here's a snapshot, here's the wallets. Consensus decision making in the sense of like, hey, like we're moderators and we're dealing with a fucking problem. Like we just gotta talk. And if you have a different set of people, they're gonna have a different set of process when it comes to talking. They're probably gonna reach a different conclusion. And lots of those decisions could end up changing and shaping the way things evolve over time. So it feels.
You could get a chaotic system, maybe. Is that what you're saying? Like the chaotic system is so sensitive to its initial starting point that it becomes very different over time, despite having much the same rule set.
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose you could say that from life. My only point is that even with the same, so I'd say two things. One, you could start with the same group of people in like two different universes, let's say, and you give them the same rule set. I'm not convinced that the exact same outcomes would come from that.
No, I'm not necessarily exactly the same. Yeah,
Okay.
I would agree with you, but mostly because the system is so complicated that there's a lot of rules that aren't really being accounted for. Like the cultural rules, there's still rules, but they're just too hard to account for. And you can't really tell people, okay, this is a rule set for today, let's go. Because they all come with their own rules and you can't erase the old ones.
There are a lot of like these implicit rules that are rules that people don't realize are rules because they might all have the same culture. So they all view things kind of the same until someone else enters that they're like, wait a minute, you're breaking the rules that we never knew we had.
That's just the one true way of doing things, don't you know?
So I don't
always
even,
bow down to a
but like, does that type of thing even, so I can think like it's possible to imagine scenarios, and maybe I've come across like one or two examples where somebody like joins a community and starts interacting in a way with the community. It's like, oh, this has created like a new problem which we haven't really like anticipated before. I mean, and so I guess what I'm getting at is like, what is the distinction between protocol and culture? Or are you just calling culture like something that doesn't exist, and culture is just like a rule set that's explicit or implicit, but we don't have a better word for it, so we just call it culture?
Well, I think if you ask an anthropologist, they'd probably trend towards the whole rule set thing. I mean, it's not that simple because the rules are kind of vague and people use their judgment and stuff. But yeah, it's mostly rule set, I would think. Like a culture or a protocol. You could call it a protocol, maybe, not so much a rule set. Rule set seems to have somebody that enforces it, but
I'm not advocating I just think that we have like a fundamentally maybe different worldview that we're coming from, where
also
I
the
think
degree of complexity is very different, and it's the different ball games. I do agree with you there. Like, and you could say that there's free will because the system is so complicated that it's chaotic. It's extremely chaotic, so we can never predict it anyway. So even if it is sort of in a way fundamentally deterministic, it doesn't make any practical difference whether it's truly deterministic but so complicated we can never predict it, or it's actually fundamentally unpredictable. Doesn't really make much of a practical difference, right? So I'm saying, like, the culture is definitely a different ballgame than a typical rule set that might even be encoded in a piece of software. So I can agree with you to that degree, you know.
right, that, yeah, and that's the only point that I was kind of trying to come back and say, is that like I don't think it's possible to kind of create you can create things that support people. So this is like kind of what I would say, Lauren, is like if you have like a Clippy, which is there to help groups make decisions and like help them like deal with conflicts and things like that. If that's a tool that comes out of that group working together and being like, we keep going through the same thing over and over again, guys. Do you guys just like want to make a shortcut? Like we'll make it together. Like when this happens. Like that's the rule. That's the protocol we're making.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Everybody's like, yeah, like that seems like a good idea. Like we're on board with that. And then the group makes that. That makes sense to me. The idea of somebody making that and then bringing that as a solution to a group and being like, hey, like this will help you. That
Yeah, but what I'm saying is the Clippy is I think a Clippy is like a really great image because it brings the conversation down. The Clippy isn't like this is what you do. The Clippy is like, oh, okay, you are at this fork in the road. I'll give you some possible options of how you can handle this together, and it can help you using the intelligence of your own group, not just be like, okay, this is what you do, but give you that information at just the right time. And that's what doesn't happen. Like, you know, in the example of holacracy, like it generally you have to, it seems like you have to like spend many hours learning this like whole system before you can even start, instead of being introduced to the concept at exactly the right time, the limited concept at exactly the right time you need to be introduced to that concept.
Okay, so it sounds a little bit like you're trying to teach people this stuff through kind of like a game or something. It's like it's a learning process rather than read this big document and then go do it. It's like that sounds good.
Yeah, so what you know, partially what led me to this is we had a conversation a while ago. So Inspiral is this group that has this whole governance now, and I was like, oh well, we can just build on Inspiral and their whole governance, and we'll just like adopt that governance as our own. But it actually like doesn't really work that way, because that governance developed through many years of working together and developing things over time that people, it's in people's heads. So the difference between like having like a whole like, you know, this big long thing of governance and what you're actually doing on the ground, there's a huge disconnect there. And so you can't really, they, you know, they might have developed these practices over time, and I'm kind of getting lost in the weeds here, but that,
That makes sense.
you know, it, for our group, like we're not in the stage yet where we need all of that. So what is the kind of like relevant things that we have to make decisions on right now without seeing all that information?
That makes sense.
That's developed, and that's what we really like don't have.
Yeah, it would be really nice to have something like that. Definitely a good idea. Were you going to say something, Sam?
Well, yeah, I mean, so I'm kind of trying to think about like analogies for it. It almost reminds me of like if you're in a session. I mean, so I think there's a question of context here where this is probably for more synchronous contexts. It's a little bit hard for me to imagine asynchronous context unless like you're just talking about a person doing work on their own and wanting to like remember what the group talked about, which is then akin to notes. But I'm trying to think of, so the real world analogy I'm thinking of where we don't have this tool is maybe a group of people in like a brainstorming session and they're putting sticky notes on a wall, and then they're not like necessarily looking at the sticky. Occasionally, like they look up at the sticky notes and they're like, oh, like remember we talked about that thing before. So I mean, the idea of like, you know, a tool that's like self-determined by a group to assist them, that makes total sense to me. And it does actually clarify it, make it a little bit more tangible in some ways for me as well. And I would also like 1,000 times raise like support and resonate what you were saying about the Inspiral group. And that's kind of what we were talking about before, is like, I've seen this a lot, I think, because Inspiral is one of the few groups that's talking about this form of governance. They've done it, and they have like Lumio and all of this stuff. And what I say to some people, and I don't know if somebody from Inspiral or Lumio is listening to this, just take it for what it is. I've like never seen a working implementation of Lumio outside of Inspiral. I've seen lots of it tried. I've never seen it like actively managed. I've never seen it like actively used. And what that comes back to me is, you know, Inspiral built a tool that fits their processes. They solve problems for themselves with Lumio. It works really well for them. It came up with them. Other people see that and they're like, oh, we want Inspiral. Let's like take Lumio and let's try to be Inspiral, but they haven't gone through all of the other stuff that Inspiral's gone through yet. Similar to what you were saying, Lauren, like you try to take Inspiral's principles and ways of working. Well, you haven't gone through the years of experimentation and learning shit together and trust building and relationship building or different experiences. And all of that builds our capacity to kind of work or follow a rule set or do a certain thing, as well as how useful it is for us. So anyway, just wanted to 1,000 times like applaud that. I think that's a really important thing to consider, which we don't always, because we see the example and we're like, we want to be that. And maybe we don't realize that that might not actually be what serves us best.
Mm-hmm.
What serves us best, you know, we can always learn, like wisdom is learning from what they say, wisdom is learning from the failure of others. So you can always learn from others' perspectives and be inspired by them and see possibilities. That's all great. A lot of the times we need to kind of experiment and do the work to figure our own stuff out ourselves.
Yeah, but I mean, like a good technology should be adaptable to different circumstances too. Like, it sounds like the Inspiral is just it's kind of in its early stages. It's the Lumio. I have read about Inspiral, but I don't remember much about it. But from your description, it sounds like it's just a technology that's in its early stages. It just needs a lot more work.
No, Inspiral, well, Inspiral's like a cooperative. Okay. I think for their use cases, Lumio is well developed.
Okay, but only when you have the training of the other people involved, right? Like to me, a good technology, a piece of like a cell phone is incredibly complicated. There's an enormous amount of knowledge packed into it, but a child can send an email to somebody across the world. That's a very refined piece of technology. Anybody can pick it up and use it, right? But with Lumio, you have this long training process and stuff, and it's not working out.
But I think we'd have to see this in a situation where like Lumio is amongst a set of alternatives. So it's like you can use Lumio as an alternative to like a forum software, maybe as an alternative to a Slack or a Discord. So it's not like there's maybe truth to what you're saying, and maybe like the people need the training, but it's also in a way like people like they're somewhere like really cool. Let's say just in some cool hip country. I don't know. I don't want to say it. Let's say in like. I was gonna make it non-specific and let's say like Coollandia. In Coollandia, they publish really cool content and there's a hammer guild. And they just have like a fucking group of people who live in dorms together and they just build shit with hammers. And they build really cool shit with hammers all the time. And it's fucking awesome. And they've been around for a long time and you see the stuff that they do. It's really amazing. And you're like, well, like I want to be like Hammer Guild. And then, so you're like, okay, well, like I just start by like picking up a hammer. But now you're like trying to use a hammer maybe to solve a different set of problems where you could use a screw, you could use a hammer and a screw, you could do other things. the Hammer Guild the hammer works for the Hammer Guild for obvious reasons. And it could work for other hammer guilds or other people who have lots of hammer-like problems, but that doesn't mean that everybody who wants to emulate the culture, let's say, or emulate the success of the hammer guild, that doesn't mean that the hammer is the best way they're going to do that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like so. I mean, they have a culture that's super specific, and they do things a certain way, but it's like just having the rules down on paper is really a different thing than understanding the culture and having that knowledge in your head of the way things work. So those are two different things, I think.
Yeah. I mean, and that's exactly, I'm sure there's lots of examples of this, but well, there's actually two things I could say. So that is exactly why you couldn't just give a group of people, in my opinion, a group of people like the rules for Wikipedia and like get the same outcomes as Wikipedia, because there's so much, maybe in Anthony's terms, there's so much complexity or chaos. There's a great, so I'm just going to link to something else that I did because it's about climate change. You don't need to read it if you want, but it covers on some of these topics. There's a video in the middle of the page, and the reason why I'm linking to the page instead of the video is because it's time linked on the video, and also there's useful context in the writing. So it's a video from Karen O'Brien. It's in the middle of the page. If you see it, it's called Taking Climate Change Seriously. So to your specific point, Lauren, when you say that like people might see the stuff, but they might not have the experience to like do it. Karen O'Brien is talking in the context of climate solutions, and she draws this distinction based on other research between technological capacity and adaptive capacity. And so what she's saying, like technological capacity is the know-how. It is the bits, it's the information, it's the word encoded in a database that you can share wherever you want. Adaptive capacity, which is more social, it depends on people's paradigms and worldviews and what they're ready for. That is totally separate, and those indeed are two separate things. And the reason she mentions this in the context of climate change is, people say all the time, like, we have all the solutions. That's just it. People say all the time, we have all the solutions. We have all the answers to climate change. Then there's either a pregnant pause, or they say like, so why isn't anything happening yet? Karen's hypothesis, which I think is very well read, it has to also do with some things with free will and that. So there's some really interesting stuff there, is that in our communities, we lack the adaptive capacity to put all of those solutions and know how to use. And some of those barriers, it could be stuff like, paradigms and worldviews, where maybe like we don't have the awareness of how important this is a problem yet. So that means that we don't have the capacity to like pick up our head and say like, let's go and talk to some neighbors and actually get solar panels on our roofs and start figuring out how we can get around like using bicycles in our neighborhood to like public transit systems instead of using our cars, because this is really serious shit. Like there's that's all social. So anyway, there's like a little framework in academic language to go along with what you were saying, Lauren.
Oh yeah, I'd be very interested in that because that's my own what I think too. I'd love to hear from Unai or Tim, because sometimes you all just sit there and then you like drop a bomb and just
I'm not even here. It's not clear to me if these guys are still at their computers or if they sort of disappeared or what.
No, I'm still here. Learning. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here as well, listening and thinking and realizing I'm not sure I have anything to say just yet. But yeah, it's like definitely right on the crux of the questions there for sure. The only stuff I was thinking about as you were chatting was language. Just that part of that complexity is wrapped up in language. The cultural and the rule discussion. That bit. The fact that we express things through language, and language itself is this sort of emergent protocol, and it's unlike, similarly to I think the conundrum you were kind of focused on there, similarly, it's a protocol that's you can't wrap your head around. It's itself emerging, right? You know, languages evolve, languages change, languages develop through use by people together. So language constantly, I guess there's situations when discussions come up that I just feel like language is a model or an example we could look to try to understand what's going on better. And I don't know if it immediately offers an answer, but there's a lot of philosophy of language, and then there's the history and the anthropology of language. And so a study of sort of language itself could be a direction to look in for, I think, trying to make more sense of that complexity that you were talking about. That was the only thought that kind of came to mind there. Yeah. Wow. I'll tell you, there's a guy in mind specifically when I think about this stuff, is a guy named Nicholas Luhmann, and Niklasluhmann, I think, Luhmann, L-U-H, yeah, something like that. He's a sociologist, systems. He's a sociologist. At the beginning of his career, he laid out his research plan. Apparently, this is how the story goes, to his profs or advisors or whatever. And he basically said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take a systems thinking, bottom up, I guess, I don't know. He laid out the program of study of society from this perspective. And he sort of laid out his fundamental approach and said, it will take me 30 years. And then he began, and he spent the next 30 years doing that. So he's a I guess a philosopher of society and like sociology and culture, and from the bottom up, he takes this systems thinking deeply into his approach. And he also was inspired by a book called The Laws of Form, which is a maddeningly confusing book by George Spencer Brown or something like that, I want to say. Yeah, George Spencer Brown. So he takes this new kind of logic, in a way, produced by this George Spencer Brown guy, that tries to go even before logic. So if you in school we studied Boolean stuff and all that stuff, right? So this George Spencer Brown went even, tried to kind of take it even more fundamental than that. And he said, and Luhmann started from that laws of form idea and built scaffolded up from there to build his theories of society. His book is called The Theory of Society. Theory of Society, Volume 1, Volume 2, etc. is his Luhmann's a culmination of his research program. And so he looks at law. He looks at the community of law. Then he looks like lawyers and law and the institutions of law. And then he looks at the community of, like, I don't have all the, maybe like healthcare or something, or care. And then he looks at maybe the community of artists and art and culture and communication and expression. So he studies those subcultures, if you like, and then sort of tries to look at, I don't want to say the rules, but it's kind of resonating with your conversation. He looks for what are the protocols? How did they emerge? Like, he goes really deep in trying to break down that kind of thing. And language and the philosophy of language comes into it a lot in his approach, naturally, because of the way he started it with the laws of form. And the laws of form is a really deceptively simple thing. It simply says that when we make a distinction, like, that's the key idea, is make a distinction. Like that's not a minor statement. That's its key thesis. So when I make a distinction in the world and I'm looking at the world, I say there are things that are hot and there are things that are cold. Boom, I just cut the world in half. I just said there are things that are hot, things that are cold. When I made the idea of that distinction, I drew a line through the world. And my example there is really, mundane, but the laws of form and the way Luhmann takes it is much, much more fundamental, like down to the abstract kind of roots of thinking and language and that. And so, for instance, if I did not cut the world into hot things and cold things, I could never talk about, I couldn't distinguish them. That couldn't come into my language, it wouldn't come up. And then the next statement couldn't use that distinction because that distinction didn't exist, right? So there's this building up and compounding of distinction on distinction on distinction, which keeps cutting the world, cutting the world, cutting the world, cutting the world until it creates this structure by which everything that you say must be understood. And you cannot say anything that is outside of those distinctions. Those distinctions kind of set the protocol, if you like. So that's the other thing, I guess, when I was listening, I was just thinking, language as a dual or metaphor of this conundrum, and then Luhmann as somebody who I think probably went the deepest in trying to square the circle of exactly what you were talking about when you were saying it's kind of rule-like, but we're also really complicated beings, and we're not entirely, exactly that kind of conundrum, or that, I don't know what you call it, but that knot, that little knot that you were untying together there. I think Nicholas Luhmann is someone who can help with that.
Tim, that was beautiful. There's two things that I want to say. Well, I suppose two comments. One, a quote, I forget where I've heard this, that we're born speaking 1,000 languages. We're born speaking 1,000 languages, and as soon as we learn our first language, we only know one, because we went from being able to kind of infinitely, maybe incomprehensibly, but having infinite conceptions of things which are not bounded. You can never split the world, to always doing it. And then there is a language similar to Esperanto, which has come out maybe in the past like 15 or 20 years. But the idea of this language is it only has 140 words. And so the idea is that for anything, and it's set at that, so you actually need to like combine words, hearkening back to much older traditions of language, in order to communicate what you're trying to say. And so as an example, I think I read this analysis. They weren't, I don't know which languages they were inspired by, but I think there's a number of them in the language that you can see. So there's some indigenous language where the word for horse is like tall dog or big dog or something like that. And so it's the same thing in this like 150 word language, where if you're trying, there's no word for horse. So if you're trying to say horse, then you put the words big and dog together. And it's like, well, like, what if you're writing that, well, then like you're going to need to interpret some shit. But it's like in the context of like, if you're talking with each other in the room, it requires significantly more maybe listening, and I don't know if emotional intelligence is the right word, but more interpretation and like more presence to kind of be on the same page. And it's funny to hear, you can read people, maybe I can find a Hacker News link, people who talk about their experiences speaking in this language. And it's just it's very different. They talk about, I don't know, generally positive feelings of it. But yeah, I thought that might be of interest.
Yeah, and so in a way that metaphor on metaphor on metaphor, like first we had dog, then we saw horse, so we called it something like, I think I saw it maybe anyway, called it beautiful, big, splendid, whatever dog. When we saw the horse, that's the similar kind of layering and layering and layering. So it's similar to the emergence of a protocol, if you like, and in this case, it's a protocol for being able to not actually have the thing in our presence and point to it, but be able to refer to it and point your mind to it. So it's a protocol for doing that. And it builds on layers and layers and layers and reentrant recursive metaphor on metaphor on metaphor. And I'll just say there's a brilliant discussion of that by it's a book called Poetic Addiction. I would recommend that to look at exactly what you were just talking about. What's his name? Starts with B. Anyway, yeah, you know, Tolkien and those guys, you know, and C.S. Lewis and that gang. The author of this Barfield is this, I forget his first name. Barfield's Poetic Addiction discusses exactly what you just brought up about the horse and then the dog and then the horse. And he goes back and he does like almost an anthropological research on a few words that he picks. And he goes back to like ancient texts and tries to find the root metaphor that led to the next metaphor. And he kind of traces that through some languages. And his point, the main point, I think of, is very similar to what you're saying. I think if not the same idea, is that we tend to think of our primitive, early, you know, quote unquote primitive. And that's exactly the point, I guess, is we think of our early language use as I guess somehow not able to say as much, or we project onto it certain judgments, I guess, about what early language was, and in a way he's trying to elevate or valorize the early language and speak to its poetry, speak to how when someone in an ancient language or ancient time just said something, that they were in the act of creating poetry when they extended the language by making those statements, and it was that poetry that stuck. It was the poetry that expressed well, that stayed and became the language that came next, you know. So same kind of idea. Anyway, Poetic Addiction. Wish I could remember his first name. Barfield. Yeah. So, just for like further kind of looking into this kind of these questions you're bringing up. Could be good. Like I always, yeah. Wish I could explain it better.
An interesting concept, this idea of a language as an evolved protocol. Kind of a difficult to get your head around, but it's a very interesting one, yeah.
I love this language with like 123 words. That is so awesome.
Yeah, it sounds like the kind of thing you're trimmed down system, that kind of like what you're talking about with your self-governance approach.
Yeah, that is super interesting. Because there's so many like concepts and protocols that like just in language that you don't realize make up your mindset, because it's like there are things that you see like politics and culture that are in front of you that you can actually see, but you have all this like structure in your mind that you can't see, that just makes up your like worldview and kind of framework, that you can't ever question, you can't see it. It just colors the way that you see and perceive everything else. Yeah, that language is very interesting.
Paki, eh? Is that what it's called?
The
Pakipona.
Tokipona, yeah.
I'll have to read more about that later.
Hey, there's one more thing I would say on this. Lauren, really agree with what you were saying too, in terms of like different perspectives. Two quick thoughts which come up sometimes, which I think are interesting to remember, is that there's some languages, I think particularly some languages from Indigenous communities in Northwest Canada. Anthony, you might be able to know more about this, I'm not sure, that where the paradigm of like nouns versus verbs is switched. So in like English, maybe we'd say 80% of the words are nouns, 20% of the words are verbs. So we end up seeing the world more as nouns. But there are some languages where that's flipped and 80% of the words are verbs and 20% are nouns. So then instead of looking at something as a tree, you're looking at something more kind of Buckminster Fuller language, you're looking at something more as a process, as a verb that's playing out. Example that comes to mind of that actually is like the word a gathering. Like if we say there's a gathering, we talk about that as a noun. There's also a way to think about that as a verb, which it is a verb, which is, or I guess it's a gerund, but a gathering, it's like people gathering, right? It's a state. The other thing I wanted to mention about how it changes our perspectives in that collaborative authoring piece that I shared above that we were talking about earlier, evolution of group decision support systems to enable collaborative authoring of outcomes. They have some interesting perspectives on there, which I think are very useful and worthwhile, on the difference between what they call rich language and restricted language. And the key point is text is restricted language. Rich language is like verbal. It's talking, it's seeing my face. I was doing some cooking in the kitchen. And so they're saying there's a fundamental difference, and also in terms of processes, there's like different utilities of reading text versus having a face-to-face conversation or listening to words or seeing a video or maybe even seeing a picture. And in there, they link to another paper, which I'd have to dig up, which is, I think it's one of the main philosophers of the 20th century. And he has a piece which is on language. And that's kind of hard to get through. It's only 13 pages, but there's a concept he says in there where he says that the only way that we actually use language to make sense of things is through metaphor. So the conversations of metaphor came up are interesting. And it's like, we can maybe say something that's like, I don't know, that's a table, but a table is just a word. Like a table doesn't like encompass what that thing actually is. But then there's a way where, I don't know, we can say it in a metaphor. It's like the thing that brings us all together. It's a metaphor and it's kind of a poem, but in some way it helps us get at maybe something more like real, because it is, it is a thing that helps us come together. Maybe that's not the only thing it is. So I'll try to find the article reference to that, but just wanted to share some thoughts for further exploration if it interests.
I think that just seeing this Tokipona, that makes me realize that's very similar to what I'm trying to do with my work with the wedding tables and stuff like that. What are because what they've done with this language is like, what are those main components that you need? 123 words, that's really like, with that you can build a whole bunch of other stuff, but how do they choose those words? And that's kind of what I'm trying to figure out. What are those like essential components that you need to build things that are much more complex?
Do they say anything about that in the article? Really don't.
What?
About how they came up with this set of rules,
I would think it's probably research and experimentation as a guess, like lots of like research for inspiration, and then just kind of like trying shit out. I would bet, and and that's something I wanted to ask earlier, Lauren, of you, is like, what is the way that we can start? Because again, going back to like Inspiral and Wikipedia, and like these things came about through experimentation. I mean, can you talk or share any way that you could actually, if you think that's useful, like start experimenting with something like wedding tables?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what we're trying to do with this group, which we consider to be more of a hub group than a group. So we're not trying to be a group here. We're trying to be a hub of network weavers. And so that's what I was trying to do with the grants, to actually start with an instance of this network, taking people from different groups and seating them at these different tables. So how I imagine a wedding table, say let's just think about it in GitHub, because that brings it down to like a manageable level of like non-abstraction. So say for example, we have like 50 different groups, let's say 50 different groups in our GitHub account, and we're trying to have some small way, we're trying to make some movement forward in terms of like working together as a group. And what we're trying to avoid the like political manifesto method of doing this, of somehow coordinating ourselves without the political manifesto and in a decentralized way. So what the grant application that I wrote was for, I think, Grant for the Web, and it was for a fellowship. And so the idea would be to, for like period of 8 weeks, seed the table. So say for example, there's a crap detection table. That table would be made of people from various groups getting together in that one group to talk about something that could affect all of their groups. And so it's what I'm trying to do with that idea is, in a network of 50 different groups, to start augmenting the level of innovation diffusion of ideas in the network and try to get them to flow more by cross-pollinating, intentionally cross-pollinating these networks, and coming up with the basic rules and the most basic policy possible for crap detection. Like, what is crap detection? What kind of bullshit could you discover in a network, whether that's like, culty stuff happening or misinformation, or and trying to say this is a first example of like a basic policy that we would need. So it's kind of like just a basic form of governance to have something there, and to try to do that over a period of like 8 weeks. So you just have something in each of these buckets that's just a simple, policy of what you're going to do, and then stop it. So it's like a time-bounded experiment, and then examining like what you have at the end to see, okay, what did this first instance do? What did we accomplish? And what would we have to change to do a second instance, another like time-bound instance of this network? So it's basically just like, what I was trying to imagine is just like the smallest experiment that I could run, and then just stop it, and then do another assessment and see what actually went right, what went wrong, like what would you need to do now. So that was just my idea. It's not a great idea, but I just couldn't think of anything better.
That's a great start. I think it is a really good idea. But it's just that it's kind of difficult to get people to put their hearts into the experiment, right? Like, and you have to get all these people. It's just, it reminds me of other situations where scientists are trying to experiment with brains. Like, it's really hard to experiment on a human brain, for instance, because they're so expensive. So that's why there's not very good science on the subject. There's great science on rat brains, but we just, it's a major barrier when it's difficult to experiment on something. How do you develop your science, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did you think, but I suggested the idea of making a meme coin, because that way it's
it's interesting that someone just came to me this week with a design for an NFT, a Buckminster Fuller NFT.
Okay.
I was like, oh, okay. And I did realize that years ago, I was talking about mimetic currencies, and no one knew what the fuck I was talking about. They were like, what is
That's
that?
not kind of
I was like, no, there's going to be a rise of mimetic currencies based on ideas, and these are going to be like $1 billion currencies. And everyone's like,
oh.
I have
Did
no
you
idea
guess
what you're
that?
saying. But I think these are like NFTs. That's what an NFT is. It's like a mimetic currency. Um, so yeah, I've been working on kind of like the foundations of what you need to have a successful mimetic currency. And this is that's it. This is what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, if you get the people motivated to participate in the experiment, because like the better they do with the task, the more money they get. Then if you could tie those together, then you could do your experimenting more, and then you could get some serious results, right?
Mhm.
Plus, the better your results are, the more you know how to do this task. Getting people to work together and detect bullshit, for instance, it has obvious applications in cryptocurrencies. Which ones are bullshit or which ones aren't?
I gotta say, I think the bullshit detection thing is like really not value adding so much. I mean, maybe it has
As
usefulness,
an example, though, as a little test run.
but why not like actually try on something more useful? I mean, like, okay, spam detection has some utility. I'm not familiar. I don't have any communities that are dealing with spam issues, and I'm in a number of communities, and I'm not
But what about like
really in any of those communities. I'm not dealing with misinformation either. So maybe I've curated my communities. But wait. Can I just keep going, Anthony, please?
Sure.
Lauren, like this is two different things. Like you're talking about, and it comes back to what Anthony said before. Like if you can communicate why this would be useful or beneficial to people, I think you could get people to participate with you. Then it's just a challenge, and that's actionable. It's like communicating, like what are the benefits you'll get from this? What are the benefits today? What are the benefits that I anticipate you'll get from participating in this hypothesis in this way? Bullshit detection doesn't sound at all like a benefit to me. Maybe there's some communities where people would be like, oh, thank God. Like we have so much misinformation from the people that we know in our community. Like we haven't figured out a way to deal with that. Maybe. I can't think of many communities where that's the case.
Well,
But
I
if
can
you
think-
go and
Oh,
say,
I
"Listen,
can, I
like,
can.
Yeah,
I
I can think
mean,
of one. But go ahead, Lauren.
so one of the huge benefits of bullshit detection is that if you have a collection of like these kind of like blockchain Web3 things, it gives you a mechanism for ensuring that investors are not investing in bullshit, and that is like most people do want.
what if they're all bullshit?"
They can't all bullshit.
Yeah,
Wait,
they could be.
wait. No, so
They
I just
totally
want to
could
say,
be.
but I'm not talking about like altcoins. I'm talking about like difference between people doing like local community currency, for example, versus like Bitcoin and Ethereum being completely centralized and like issuing more tokens and trying to sell more tokens, including to venture capital funds. A big part of this being bullshit because they're unregulated, so they can get everyday people participating in these unregulated markets and Ponzi schemes where there hasn't been access to it before. I'm not saying that blockchain as a whole is that, but just if we're going to talk about the utility of this and we're going to say like, oh, like these little coins out there are like bullshit, you know, like what about the big picture? What isn't? And then what is like the utility?
Yeah. That's part of bullshit detection. It seems like a major application for it, because if you can decide that Ethereum is actually not going to get very far because it's actually kind of bullshit, it can't scale or whatever, then that's going to get you a lot of money. So you can do your experiments. You can, you know,
Well,
there's money taking out of that if you can make good decisions like that.
So the way that I've come to learn those things is not like a lot of years of effort or a lot of subject matter experience, but from like reading a couple of perspectives here and there, and from like having the input of a couple of people who've helped like show those perspectives with me. So, and I'm not saying an analog of like, that didn't come from like bullshit detection. That just came from like, I don't know, like me stumbling across a couple of pieces that articulate things really well here and then. So that actually, I just want to say that's not like a machine, that's not a system, that's just an article, which is sharing knowledge.
Well, but it's a group of people sharing knowledge and trying to pierce the veil of what's going on here and figure out what's legit and what's not, right? Whether it's
I would also say that as a woman working in collective intelligence, that I have found that my perspective on peer-to-peer organizing is that there's just like a tremendous potential for abuse anytime you have like people like, oh, we're doing things differently, like it's regenerative and we're not doing things in an old like top down style, and there's like some new way of doing things that leaves you totally open to just abusive practices that are hidden behind these like great words. So they're just things that happen like again and again, but there's no in even in a corporation, even if it's like fucked up, there's some kind of HR to go to if you're being like sexually harassed, or if there's like some weird shit going on, there's someone dealing with that problem. And to build a peer-to-peer system with no checks and balances on danger or bullshit or lies or something, that is just like, to me it's just
Luckily, that's not system.
I think those are probably real those are real problems. I don't know how many people they affect. I don't know how many communities they affect. My point is that no matter what we do, we have opportunity costs. As long as there's just one of us, we can choose to work on this. We can choose to work on this. I was more excited when you were talking about things that are like, yeah, like, you know, this is an experiment that will help like you get better outcomes together, like outcomes that you wish for, like get better progress on accomplishing what you want to do. I don't exactly understand the mechanisms of it, but when you're talking in those terms, it like resonated with me. When you're telling me like, oh, like, you know, you should participate because bullshit detection is important. I'm like, I don't give a fuck. It's not a problem for me at all.
Yeah, that's why you wouldn't be in that group. But there could be other people who the purpose of collective intelligence is that each person has different brains, and your brain is like, what can we build together? And
no,
my perspective,
that's not my brain. I'm
really?
I'm just sharing patterns. I'm like,
Okay.
yeah, I'm just trying to share
I'm just
like
saying,
knowledge pieces.
if you're building like, if you're building something where you have like massive innovation without the detection of bullshit and things that could go wrong, you could be building things that were extremely dangerous. And this is what happened with the blockchain. They built this a very, very dangerous technology that basically it allows you to massively incentivize things with no corresponding social moderation functions. So, you know, tremendous problems will arise because of this, because you're not building this technology with that.
I think there's truth to what you're saying, and I'm going to jump off too. I'm just saying, as a person who could potentially participate in your experiments, I was interested when you were talking about like groups working together in potentially new ways, finding ways to share knowledge, like get stuff done together. Like I was interested, and I was really thinking, like hoping to hear more, and that's why I said like I would love to see more about like what are the tangible benefits you expect from this. I really lost interest, like almost completely. Maybe it's a language thing, but also I specified why I lost interest, because it's not a problem I see in any communities that I deal with around the bullshit detection thing.
This is also an example of how to get stuff done, of one piece of how to get stuff done.
Right, but what I'm saying is like, yeah, that is one example of an experiment, right? And this comes back to my suggestion earlier, which is like, I don't know if that's the first experiment you want to do. If that seems really important, then maybe do it. Just to me, I would be interested in participating in an experiment focused on something else. And I'd be really uninterested in participating in an experiment focused on bullshit detection. I'm saying that hopefully it's helpful.
But what I'm saying is you have people interested in doing different things, and that is what I'm trying to do. You're not interested in, that's totally fine. And that's not like the main part of it. That's a small part of things that need to happen. And people can choose where they would go to. And there could be many choices of what you would choose to focus on, and you don't see bullshit as something that's a priority or something that you're interested in, or something you've seen, or some other person may see that and it may be something that they want to contribute to. So they're different, you know.
Yeah, Sam, what would be a good component piece for you to jump in on?
I don't know, but that's exactly what I'm saying. I want to understand. Like, so this is my understanding, and then I'm just going to jump off. So I understand that, Lauren, in order to make progress, you're talking about wanting to do an experiment. And what's blocking you is that you don't have participants to do an experiment. My only point from like 7 minutes ago was that maybe what could help get participants is to communicate what the benefits to those participants could be. Maybe it's hard to
Right.
explain, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. See that. And if I take a look at what the potential benefits could be, like really concretely, and if I like that, and if I'm willing to like, I don't know, invest a little time on a chance that maybe this works, maybe it doesn't, then maybe I'd be in. So that's all I'd say is it's exactly what you're talking about now, Anthony. What is the category? I have no idea. I just want to know what the benefits could be to see if I want to participate.
That's a good
Have a
point.
good Friday, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, Sam. See you around. So I don't see why money can't be the benefit of participating in the experiment. I mean, it seems like the obvious incentivizer. Like, there's a lot of different ways to connect money and getting stuff done, relatively basic, trivial stuff, but still stuff through cryptocurrencies. Whether it's sorting through the different cryptocurrencies to decide which one's going to go up, that could be a type of bullshit detection. See which ones are just pump and dump schemes, which ones don't have a legitimate technology behind them, which ones
Yeah,
do.
like so right now it's really difficult to, we don't even have a consensus on what is bullshit and what's not bullshit, like basic principles that we can agree on that makes up value for like a cryptocurrency. Like what does currency need to have in order to, like what needs to be there, and we don't really know, so it's all like a marketing thing. And without this, like the it just, it basically depends on, cryptocurrency is all like surrounded, it's all like charismatic guys, like who are the popular guys who can just like produce like a bullshit factory of,
Get all the followers on Twitter to buy the stuff. Get the cryptocurrency exchanges to support the currency.
Yeah, so I mean it's so what got me to thinking of this is like the idea of something like Standard and Poor's, these kind of like risk assessment agency, they have to understand, like for clearly they fell off the table in terms of derivatives, but what they do is this kind of assessment, like these, and that's what we don't have in this like open source world with these patterns that people like pull out in the universe. Are they good? Who knows? We don't have a way of assessing them. And so without this, what?
We don't have an efficient way of assessing them, but it's kind of a little bit like voting with your feet. Like people join the projects because they think they're promising, but that's grossly inefficient. You have to go through the whole development process before the idea turns out to be promising or not.
Yeah, it's really, so what I'm trying to do is, if you can have even like just basic concepts of like, what do you need to have a, say, a cryptocurrency or something that's complicated, that is not bullshit, like what are the specific things that you need to have in place, and then you can start like assessing what's in your own network, as well as having clear rules of who can come into this membrane and who can't. To me, that's really essential. And when you have that kind of stuff, then you can build much more complicated things. And so like when these assessors came along, like Standards and Poor's, and then put on ratings of these complicated financial instruments that no ordinary people could understand, but then they would understand their risk of the investment. And that way they would be like, oh, okay, so I don't understand this derivative or something because I'm not a math expert, but I know it's been reviewed as having this kind of risk, so I know what I'm getting into here, and I feel comfortable investing at this level of risk. Or maybe I want treasury bonds because I want a sure bet. So we don't have anything like that in this new peer-to-peer world, and it's just very, very difficult, even if you're in it, to make good assessments about what has value and what doesn't.
We have a kind of a very disjoint group of experts, and you go and you find the right blog and you find somebody that you trust and you listen to what they have to say, but
Mhm.
it's not very well organized, and it's not very efficient. It's not very good. But
Right.
you can say that about a lot of different things that we're doing and not doing. Like there's always lots to do, and
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, I
so
mean,
the way I see it, I see that, okay, so for example, I just talked to this guy this week, the one who proposed this Buckminster Fuller and NFT. He has this really, I think, incredible algorithm that he's developed over 20 years called AkiWiki. And it's basically using psychology and game theory to create this algorithm that leads people to win-win situations. So it's kind of like a decentralized moderation mechanism to lead to a successful outcome.
that sounds pretty
Um,
cool.
which is if it works, it is a like significant scientific achievement.
Yeah.
We don't know if it works because it hasn't been tested at scale, but he's been working on it for a while. And so this is, obviously has some bit of complexity in it, and being able to like present this to a group of people who are like who from different domains who could listen to this and either give it their stamp of approval, or if not, like having people with different minds get together who were good bullshit detectors and give feedback and be like, we would approve this if it had the X, Y, and Z. These are the things that we would be concerned with that you need to fix. But actually being able to get a stamp of approval from very well-trained bullshit detectors from different domains would be a huge step forward for someone who claims, like this guy is making big claims, like Sergey Brin, like this is this Google algorithm can like change the world, and it could be like worth $100 billion. Like, is that stupid? So I think that could, in terms of if you're trying to get investment, that and you're trying to get partners, investment, stuff like that, having a group like this giving that kind of stamp, because nothing like that really exists, that could be a
This
real.
reminds me of the peer review process for scientists getting a grant. This is something I read about a lot. They have a peer review process, which sounds very similar to what you're talking about.
Yes, exactly. It is
It's
like,
kind of laborious. Like these trained people are hard to produce. They're very labor intensive to produce, right? So their time's pretty valuable, and it's kind of hard to get them to give you feedback, right?
yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah, so there needs to be peer review. But if you had that peer review, it'd be pretty awesome.
yeah, it would have lots of applications. If you could integrate knowledge from a large group of people, maybe a
Mm.
larger group of people, but the scientists is a relatively small group of people that are highly trained and really smart.
Mm.
If you could make do with a larger group of less trained people, then that would have enormous implications and great applications in the near term.
Yeah, and I think that that's doable. I mean, just having people from different domains come together and assessing something is very, very valuable, I think.
So
Um,
you think you might be able to try and experiment with this NFT, the Buckminster Fuller NFT thing?
yeah,
How does it work exactly? I've never been clear exactly how NFTs work.
yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's so
A little bit
I
abstract.
feel the same way. Like it's just kind of a mystery, which is what I'm which is what I'm trying to say. There's just like so much that you need to get right to have these, like, to complete a successful currency. It's like there's a lot of working parts is what I'm saying that you have to get right, and that's a high level of complexity that yeah.
Hmm. Well, why don't you, I mean, I'm just trying to think of an experiment that would tie the results of the group,
Mm.
how successful they are at bullshit detection, to a very obvious and immediate financial gain. And the obvious thing to do would be just take a big list of altcoins and cryptocurrencies and say, okay, which one's most promising? And the group works on it for a week or something. And they come up with their recommendation. And then the people in the group are the first ones to get the recommendation because they're part of the group. So they speculate with a couple $100 or something. And then if it goes up in the next week, then they get a bunch of money. So it seems like, and you as the conductor of the experiment would have your protocol and say, okay, here's the test protocol for this week. This is the way we're going to do things for this week. And you see what kind of results you get. And you could just measure the average financial gain. And then that would tell you how successful the group was at detecting bullshit, basically. Does that make some sense? Like that way you have your quantitative measurement of how well the group performed. You can pick a
So
new group.
what, how would you know, I mean, how would you know, tell me again, like how, because you don't know for many years sometimes whether these things are bullshit or not.
Well, yeah, that's true. That's a good point. Yeah, you'd have to, to get good results. Again,
I
it's
mean,
a
Bernie Madoff seemed like that seemed really great for a number of years, and
what did?
Bernie Madoff's business,
Oh yeah,
you know,
yeah, that's true.
maybe,
But I mean, to be fair, I mean, a lot of people did make a lot of money off of it, so it wasn't bullshit for them because some of the people at the top of the pyramid, they did make lots of money.
right,
So as far as they're
right,
concerned, it was a winning investment.
right.
So if at an early stage,
Mhm,
say in the early years of the Bernie Madoff scheme,
mhm.
somebody said, okay, well, this is a way to make money. It's got a high rating. But you
Yeah,
have
I
to
mean,
get
I
right.
think so. What I'm trying to do is, and you know, the crap detection isn't like the only thing of what I'm doing, but yeah, I would argue that it is very, very important, especially in all this peer-to-peer business, because it opens the doors for a massive amount of bullshit that I don't know how Sam doesn't see that in any group. To me, I see that in a lot of groups, and
Yeah, I was
there's
kind of
these
baffled.
shadows and.
He seems to be a little overconfident in his ability to detect bullshit on his own, just with reading what other people have to say and coming to a quick conclusion. Whereas I think there's a great deal more depth to it. I think you could read until you're blue in the face about all the different cryptocurrencies and still have not much of an idea which one's going to go up and which one's going to go down,
Yeah.
or which one actually has technical merit, for instance.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you know, some may have technical merit, but then they don't have like what I'm talking about is they don't have any kind of social mechanisms or any kind of moderation or any like real
Like a community.
governance.
Yeah, community and governance mechanisms around them.
Mhm.
Yeah, and it's hard to discern which groups. I was trying to figure out for a while there how exactly the governance systems around Bitcoin worked. And I chose Bitcoin just because I figured it would be relatively easy to find documentation on it.
Mhm.
I'm more interested in Monero, but it was even more difficult to find out how the community actually operates. Like if you were a little alien up in the sky and you were looking down at all the people and how they interacted and how they did things, what would you describe the system as? And that's very difficult to find. So the crap detection group would certainly have their work cut out for them, but there's a lot of value in determining what's up there. Because some of these projects are really hollow, like they don't have any community behind them. Or the community is just a centralized organization with a couple of leaders and
Or maybe they have like a wonderful community, but they don't have mechanisms in place. Like if there is a conflict, they don't have something in place to resolve that conflict.
yeah.
So it can be like seem amazing, and then you know, and 2 months later, it's just like poof, it goes away.
Yeah, exactly. Like it could be technical difficulties with the technology, or it could be problems with the community. Could be a random event like some kind of blockchain fork that just doesn't get resolved for some reason.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to discern there. Seems like should be a lot of money to shake out if you can get some methods working.
So apart from the crap detection, there might be like you know, simple ways of just doing scoring with each group, like what kind of decision making mechanisms do they have in place? Do they have anything written down?
Yeah.
Their rules? Do they have uh, you know, etc.
So you get your group of 50 people together and then say go, and then when they're done, you say, okay, write down all your rules and then see how well they've recorded it. What are you
Yeah,
talking
yeah, that's what I'm trying to do.
about? Okay.
to try to actually get
They
just
would
a
probably
first
want some
sense
guidance.
of what?
They would probably want some guidance at the beginning, because otherwise, I don't know, people are just going to bumble around for a long time before they get any. People
Yeah, and
bumble
that's what I'm trying to get funding to do, to get like initial, like, here is what you have to do, and get that organized, so you give them the the right level of guidance, but have them be autonomous enough. And that's very tricky to get right, because sometimes you give them too much, sometimes you give them too little.
Yeah.
But like, it may be like, I have on the wedding table like a stewardship table. Like, if people were thinking 10 years in the future and they decide things like ownership and value, how do we decide who owns what and who has contributed value? And if you could like, just we have so very little of this that functions together, that even simple rules give us something to at least have to give feedback. It's gonna suck, clearly, but at least there's something that sucks that you can define what it is that sucks about it.
Okay, so then you can make progress for your next generation, the next version, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's clearly like not going to be like, wow, an amazing smart network. It's probably
Not
going
right
to
off
be,
the bat.
it's probably
Maybe
going to be pretty stupid and not working very well, but at least you'll be able to see where it's not working.
Yeah, and then your 10th generation, your 20th generation is going to be like pretty impressive and usable, hopefully. Like it's
Yeah, I
something.
mean, it's designed so that repeat iterations get smarter and smarter, because
Okay.
you have the feedback loops. Like, you have a table of that's like incoming suggestions of what can be approved. You have another table that's like shit bullshit that we've noticed, like the things that are going wrong. You have a collaboration table that or a conflict resolution table. When there's a conflict, what do we do when there's conflict? So they write down some rules of like, what do you need to do in the beginning to avoid conflict, and how do we handle conflict when there is conflict? Because one thing I've noticed that's in groups like Sensorica and stuff, if there's no just one person saying who's the leader, it's very, very difficult to get through conflict in these decentralized groups. Very difficult.
Yeah. In a decentralized group and a centralized group, it sounds like a centralized group that you're describing. The Sensorica is pretty centralized right now, and
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's why it's lasted, because it's centralized.
Yeah, I guess, but we're trying to move away from that. Like, it's also a weakness too, because if TV disappears, then the whole thing's going to collapse, right? If TV gets
Absolutely. Yeah,
so,
but it's super difficult to move to centralized to decentralized. Like, TV, he does everything that he can sometimes to like try to get people to do stuff, and it's really difficult. They're just like, oh,
yeah.
leader, just tell him what to do.
I've seen before though, like sometimes the leader is quite hesitant to let go, and they're justified in being that hesitant because they know people are going to make a mess of it if they let go of the stuff that they've been working on really hard.
Yeah.
But I think TB is motivated. He's a rare character who is motivated to get things decentralized over longer term. We were talking about multi-signature wallets, for instance, to transfer the money, the 17,000 bucks or whatever it is, and make sure that gets decentralized a little better. And he was very much interested in doing that. So I'm hopeful that, but you have to have somebody, you have to have the nugget of motivation that will evolve over time into something that might actually be different. Otherwise, like I've had other experiences with organizations where the leader didn't really want to give up power. They kind of liked it. And so although they talked about decentralization quite a bit, they never really gave up their power. And 7 years later now, it's basically the same as it ever was.
Oh,
But
yeah.
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 But I'm hopeful for Sensorica anyway.
It is very, very difficult to start off decentralized in a network. It's very difficult.
Yeah. To be fair, there are some examples that are not obvious, and you get these groups that form on IRC channels, and like this Dogecoin, for instance, you get a community that did form, and they're not formal organizations, so they don't have names that you can look up and you can't Google them easily. But you do get some. I think it is a thing in our society where we are getting some decentralized groups. Or like I say, when I say decentralized, there's decentralized and there's centralized, and there's a whole spectrum in between. Like Sam was saying, but I think relatively flat organizations when I say flat, I mean like that histogram of people and their relative power in the organization is not too bumpy. It does happen. It's definitely a thing, but we don't hear about it that much because when it does happen, we don't recognize it's happening.
Yeah, I feel like it doesn't happen
Not very much.
generally, like it happens naturally by some group just forming decentrally, but it doesn't happen by people being like, we're gonna have a group that's decentralized. That usually
Yeah, I think so.
someone
Yeah, it's definitely much more prone to evolving than it is. But if you couldn't kickstart it, I mean, you could say the same about life too. And there's a lot of people working really hard to make these synthetic bacteria. And they believe there's great promise in doing that. I'm not sure exactly what the application for synthetic bacteria is, but there's clearly applications for protocol for a basic decentralized organization.
I think for me, one problem is that with my work is it seems like the blockchain has already kind of solved this problem that I'm working on, but it's
Okay,
really
so-
not, and it's gonna show like these.
Yeah, I think there's a fair number of people that are realizing that it's not decentralization, it's much more than blockchain, and it's much more than smart contracts too.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
But people are really enthusiastic about it now, so the iron is hot. Like this is a good time,
Mhm.
I think. They're in the
Yeah.
right business, as far as I can tell. We should probably wrap it up, I guess. I'm getting kind of
All
cold.
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I hope to see you again next time. And
Yeah, it's been
maybe-
great.
yeah, That's
I love to have your mind to talk about things.
thank you.
It's great.
I really am interested in this subject. This is something I've thought about many times over the years. I remember in Vancouver, there was a guy who we went to a workshop and he said, put your most favorite idea in the hat. And we're going to talk about this for 10 minutes at the table or whatever. And my idea was what I called at the time people group programming.
Okay.
And it was in aid of getting decentralized organization. And this was an outgrowth of what had happened at Occupy in 2012,
Uh-huh.
because we were always trying to do things in a decentralized way. And we weren't very successful at it, but that's where I got my major interest in that. So, and I walked home with the guy who was a doctor who was working on toilets in Africa. And we talked about this idea, and I had a great difficult time explaining to him why it would be valuable. And he was like, "Oh, people are already doing that." And I'm like, "Not really." And so yeah, I'm very much interested in this concept.
And there could be, could be that there are components all around that we can't see that people have already discovered how to solve these issues, but it's very difficult to find them, and sometimes you don't have the language to find these people.
Yeah, I think so. I think probably because there's been a lot of people working on it for a very long time.
Yeah.
So there's got to be some good stuff, but it's not going to be easy to gather it up and sort through it and refine it and make it all into a good protocol that can be used, or whatever the goal is exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I got to go, but we'll
Okay.
talk to you later. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.